Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Archives and Anchovies, the podcast where I talk about whatever it is I want to talk about that week. This week, we have something that is pretty special to me because it blends a lot of things that I really enjoy, two things especially, and that's history and music. If you've listened to my other podcasts, you know that I'm a musician and I've played music pretty much all my life since I was 7 years old. I actually was in college several years ago wanting to write film scores, so classically trained, and composition was one of the things that really I was impassioned about and was doing quite well in before I left to find a career in business. So it's never left me though, and I enjoyed listening to as much classical music and modern contemporary music and jazz as I could get my hands on. So later on in life, one of the things that I have become to like is history as well. So, especially American history. And so I was on a business trip and I was flying home. And typically, I don't like to play games or anything on my phone, but I do always have a couple of books. And I just happened to be reading Ron Chernow's Alexander Hamilton, a biography, which is the book that inspired the musical. And while I'm flying, I always have my noise canceling headphones on, and typically I have some sort of light classical music playing in the background. And so about, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 minutes into the flight, this piece by Mozart comes on. And I was kind of bopping my head around to Mozart, which is probably pretty funny on a plane if you could hear. Somebody was probably thinking I was listening to something else. And it got me thinking that Mozart and Hamilton actually lived at the same time in history, which started to boggle my mind. So once I got home, I did some research and found out that when the time periods that they were both alive were pretty close to each other. So I thought it would be a cool podcast and something that was really interesting to me to think of two geniuses that never met, that were across the Atlantic Ocean and probably never even knew of each other. We often talk about the fact that, genius level people, there's a couple of them on the planet at a time. And to me, I believe that both these men, Alexander Hamilton and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, were both geniuses. So it's quite interesting. So Mozart, he was born January 27th, 1756. And Hamilton, although there is some controversy, was either 1755 or 1757. So kind of on the other bookends of when Mozart was born. And it was kind of interesting because they both lived in a time of rebellion. So quite a bit different rebellion. They were both in a time where people were revolutionizing, of course, in America, the Revolutionary War and things of that nature. And then Mozart was a bridge between the Bach um, style of music and into the classical period. As I stated before, these men never met. They never even probably heard of each other. They were both reshaping the music and the world exactly the same moment in history. So let's start in Salzburg, 1761. 5-year-old Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart sits at a harpsichord composing his first pieces. If you don't know, it's a Churchill catalog numbers that they do, and it's basically, it started at 1 and 1D. Basic, simple keyboard works that showed that he had astonishing understanding of musical form. His father, Leopold, a respected violinist and composer as well, realized his son is extraordinary, but his Wolfgang at this point isn't alone. His sister Nannerl is also a prodigy and a brilliant keyboard player in her own right. In 1762, Leopold takes both children on tour. They perform for the Empress Maria Theresa in Vienna. 6-year-old Wolfgang jumps into the Empress's lap and asks her to marry him. If you've seen the movie Amadeus, you know that he said, my own cousin Antoinette jumped into her arms and says, will you marry me, yes or no? So it wasn't actually Antoinette, but the picture's the same. The court is enchanted by Mozart. From 1763 to 1766, the Mozart family embarks on a grand tour of Europe. He travels to Munich, Paris, London, and Hague, Amsterdam. Wolfgang performs for King Louis V at Versailles, for King George III in London, and that's important because King George is pretty important in Hamilton's life as well. He meets Johann Christian Bach, who becomes a mentor. By age 8, Wolfgang has composed his first symphony. By 10, his first oratorio. By 12, his first opera. Now let's cross the Atlantic on a completely different spot in the world. The boy who would become Alexander Hamilton was born on Nevis, probably 1755 or 1757. This is pretty debated, and in the book, he actually goes through, why these records were not kept so well in these islands, especially in the Caribbean. So it's a really kind of an interesting thing. Nevis is one part of the Caribbean islands, and so they didn't really have great record keeping for that portion of it. So we don't really know the exact date of Alexander Hamilton's birth. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, had been imprisoned by her first husband for adultery before escaping the Caribbean. So, right there is a stark contrast to Mozart. Mozart and his dad and his sister traveled around all of Europe, and Alexander Hamilton's mother is imprisoned for adultery. His father, James Hamilton, was a Scottish merchant who abandoned the family when Alexander was about 10 years old. So it's not like Mozart, where he's 10 years old and he's traveling around in a carriage to Europe to all these different cities. But in 1768, while Mozart was performing his opera, La Finta Semplice, for the emperor in Vienna, 11-year-old Alexander Hamilton was clerking in a trading firm on St. Croix. When Hamilton's mother died of yellow fever in 1768, and he and his brother were briefly taken in by his cousin. If you've seen the musical or heard the musical, it talks about it right at the very beginning, that cousin then committed suicide. In the book, it goes through a lot of detail on the fact that Hamilton basically was extremely, extremely poor at this point, and he was essentially an orphan. He was then apprenticed by merchants Nicholas Kruger, who would be a lifelong influence for him, and David Beacom. But here's where Hamilton's genius emerges. By age 14, in contrast to Mozart, who was writing music by this time and writing his operas, by age 14, he was left in charge of Kruger's entire trading operations. While Kruger traveled to New York for health reasons, Hamilton managed ships, cargo, negotiations with sea captains, and all of the day-to-day activities for Kruger's operations. His letters from this period are remarkable, crisp, authoritative, sophisticated beyond his years, and in one letter, he rejects a shipment of mules as a mere skeleton, as it says in quotes, and demands better quality. He was only 14, and he had the courage to stand up to people and tell them they would not accept a shipment of mules. I don't think I was that way at 14, so I can definitely see that he was definitely a very, very sharp individual. Then, on August 31st, 1772, the hurricane came. A catastrophic storm devastated St. Croix. Hamilton wrote a description for the Royal Danish American Gazette. This is a pretty amazing thing from a 17-year-old kid, as I would say it at that time. These are quotes. The roaring of the sea and the wind, fiery meteors flying about in the air, the prodigious glare of almost perpetual lightning, the crash of the falling houses, and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed were sufficient to strike astonishment into angels. Pretty powerful stuff from a 17-year-old. This actually caused the local businessmen to be extremely impressed with Hamilton, and they raised money to send him to North America for his education. By late 1772 or early 1773, Alexander Hamilton arrived in New York. Mozart had been composing for 15 years at this point, and Hamilton was just beginning his ascent. So let's talk about 1776. You've obviously heard that date on the American Revolution side, but Mozart is 20 years old. He's employed as a court musician in Salzburg under the Archbishop Colloredo, a job he absolutely hates and despises. He's composing violin concertos, serenades, church music. It's fantastic work, but Mozart feels trapped. The Archbishop treats its musicians as service, and Mozart wants to be free and free to compose what he wants, to work for himself. If you've ever seen the movie, there's a point in the time where Leopold goes to visit him, and Mozart is asked by his father if he has any students. And Mozart comes back and says, I don't want students, I want to compose. And he says that Leopold says to him that composing doesn't make money. And Mozart then says a snarky comment, says that one will, but we'll get to that a little bit later. But that same year, while Mozart was doing that, across the ocean, Hamilton is at King's College in New York, now Columbia University. He's 19 or 21, depending on the true birth year, and he's writing pamphlets that are setting America on fire. In December 1774, Hamilton publishes a full vindication of the measures of Congress, defending the First Continental Congress against a loyalist critic. People assume it is written by someone like John Jay, a seasoned lawyer. They're shocked to learn the author is a teenage college student. In February 1775, he publishes The Farmer Refuted, a 35-page demolition of loyalist arguments. He's quoting Hobbes, Locke, Pufendorf, and Blackstone, and he's constructing legal, and philosophical arguments with devastating precision. He's just an absolute monster at this point. Ron, in the book, goes through and talks about how this pamphlet and him writing under Pluribus, the name, and different aliases that he had while he was writing all of these letters, it was something that was pretty common at the time. We think right now, if you had social media or you had YouTube or any of those right now, Mozart and Hamilton would know each other. Hamilton would be listening to Mozart piano sonatas while he's writing congressional documents and things like that. That wasn't the case this point. They really didn't have that type of communication. So what it was a lot of pamphlets, and it was a lot of things that ended up in papers. And that's how they basically did their work through these, especially in the early phases of the Continental Congress. When fighting breaks out in April 1775, Hamilton joins a militia company. By March 1776, he's an artillery captain in command of his own company. At the Battle of Trenton, Washington notices a young artillery officer expertly directing fire. By March 1777, Hamilton is Washington's aide-de-camp, essentially his chief of staff. This is an important aspect because in the musical and in the book, they stress the fact that the relationship between Hamilton and Washington was very tumultuous at times, but also was lifelong. So they became lifelong friends, but mostly they were a very large complement to each other in the way they thought and the way they spoke and the way they wrote things down. So very, very critical. Here's what's fascinating though. Hamilton wasn't just a soldier. He was Washington's writer. Every critical letter, every general order, every communication with Congress, Hamilton drafted most of them. He was writing on average 10 to 15 hours a day. So in contrast, Mozart was composing 10 to 15 hours a day. Hamilton was writing 10 to 15 hours a day, and he was studying. He ordered books on military strategy, economics, and government. He was teaching himself to build a nation. Meanwhile, in 1777, at the same time, Mozart is in Germany, falling in love with Aloysia Weber, a soprano. His mother, accompanying them, dies in Paris in July 1778. So Mozart did have some time with his mother, where Alexander Hamilton, his mother died at the age of 10. So another little bit of a contrast. But Mozart was devastated and returns to Salzburg, but he can't stay. In 1781, he finally breaks with Archbishop Colloredo, literally. After a dispute, the Archbishop's steward kicks Mozart down the stairs and out of service. Mozart moves to Vienna and does something revolutionary. He becomes a freelance musician. This almost doesn't exist in 1781. Musicians work for courts, for churches, for patrons. Mozart decides to support himself through piano performances, composing operas, teaching students, and publishing music. It's precarious, but it's freedom. So one of the things that you'll notice here is both Hamilton and Mozart were very much into freedom, not only freedom for themselves and freedom to choose, but freedom in their crafts and in their arts. Mozart's music becomes revolutionary too. In 1786, Mozart premieres The Marriage of Figaro in Vienna. The opera is based on a play that was actually banned in Vienna for being too politically inflammatory. It's about a servant, Figaro, who outwits his master. This is a radical world in absolute monarchy. The music itself is revolutionary. Mozart creates distinct musical personalities for each character. The ensembles are impossibly complex, 7 people singing at once, each with different music and different motions, yet it all fits together perfectly. It's architectural genius. If you've ever seen the film, this is a part where Mozart is basically pleading with the individuals that are on the opera board, I will call them, the archbishops and things like that. And he basically pleads them. He says, with music, all these things can be happen. If people are just arguing, it's noise, but with music and key, it can be a beautiful thing. So that same year, across the lake, I'll call the Atlantic Ocean a lake. That same year, 1786, Hamilton is practicing law in New York and representing clients in major commercial cases. He's building the legal foundations for American capitalism. He's arguing cases about property rights, international trade, contract law, and he's helping to establish precedents that will shape American commerce for centuries. So let's jump to 1787. This is where both men reach new heights of systematic genius. In Vienna, Mozart composes Don Giovanni, which premieres in Prague, October 1787. This isn't just an opera, it's a philosophical meditation on freedom, consequence, and morality. Don Giovanni is a libertine who seduces women and kills the father of one victim. At the end, a stone statue comes to life and drags Giovanni to hell. But here's what's brilliant. Mozart makes us sympathize with Don Giovanni. The music is so seductive, so vital, that we're torn. The finale is terrifying. Mozart uses trombones associated with the death and supernatural, chromatic harmonies, and a sense of inevitability. It's the sound of judgment. Musically, Mozart is working at the highest level of complexity. The second act finale of Don Giovanni runs over 20 minutes of continuous music with multiple key changes, multiple tempos, multiple dramatic layers, and it's structured like a mathematical proof, each section leading directly into the next. Same year, 1787, Hamilton is in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention. He gives a 6-hour speech proposing his vision of American government. It's too radical, and he wants the president and senators to serve for life, wants to reduce state power dramatically, and the convention rejects most of his ideas. Interestingly enough, in the book, Ron talks about how spoke for 6 hours. There was basically a word, or not a word, that was really spoken about his entire 6-hour speech. They left, and it was never talked about again. So it's very interesting because of all the ideas and all the things that are there, they basically just never even thought about them. It was something that he had drafted, and in the book, it talks about how up to that point, he was pretty reserved, which was uncharacteristic for Hamilton. And it's something to where he basically unloaded in this 6-hour torrent of words, and then it was never talked about again. But then comes Hamilton's greatest work, the Federalist Papers. From October 1787 to August 1788, Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay write 85 essays arguing for the ratification of the Constitution. Hamilton himself writes 51 of them, and they're not short op-eds. Essay Federalist number 78, where Hamilton explains judicial review, runs over 5,000 words just on its own. Federalist number 70 on executive power, another 4,000 words. He's writing these while practicing law full-time, while managing his family, and while sleeping maybe 4 hours a night. One of the things that happens during this time as well is they talk about illness and tiredness and things of that nature. So if you can imagine, both of these men were exhausting themselves writing their craft and doing their craft. Mozart, probably in a little bit different position than Hamilton, was also a party goer. So he was one that would stay up and want to peruse with all the people and be the center of attention and go out and perform, just kind of like musicians today. So maybe that's where it all started, where Hamilton had a family, and he was very devout to that family as well. The Federalist Papers are systematical philosophy. Hamilton constructs arguments like Mozart constructs symphonies, each section building on the last, each idea supporting the whole structure. Federalist number 1 introduces the themes. The middle numbers analyze the failures of the Articles of Confederation, the structures of the new government, and the separation of powers. The final numbers defend the Constitution against specific objections. It's architect and prose. In 1789, George Washington becomes the first president. He appoints Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasury, and Hamilton is only 32 or 34 years old, and he's about to design the financial systems of the United States from scratch. And nothing like what he built had existed in previous history. So that same year, Mozart premieres Così fan tutti in Vienna. It's an opera about love and fidelity. Two soldiers disguise themselves to test their fiancé's loyalty, and the women fail the test. It's a darker, more cynical work than Figaro. Mozart is exploring the limits of enlightenment rationality. Can love be reduced to logic? The music suggests not. In January of 1790, Hamilton submits his first report on public credit to Congress. It's 40,000 words, about 80 pages. In it, Hamilton proposes that the federal government assume all the state debts from the Revolutionary War, establish public credit, and create a national bank. It's not just an economic plan, it's a vision of American power. At this point, Hamilton is treading on, treading on light ground because he is not in favor with a lot of people because of his brash style. The people that do support him heavily, though, are really, really entrenched in his corner. So it was very much a struggle for this. Here's what Hamilton understood. Credit is trust. If America pays its debt, if it honors its obligation, investors will trust it. That trust becomes capital. That capital becomes growth. And Hamilton's thinking 50 years ahead. He's imagining factories, trade networks, infrastructure. He's imagining America as a commercial and industrial power that could rival Britain and any of the other economies that are in the world at the time. Congress, however, is skeptical. Southern states want more of an agrarian society, so built on agriculture and things of that nature. They have all of their debts paid off for, and they don't want to assume the northern debts. Hamilton, in a stroke of genius, makes a deal. Right at this point in time, they were trying to determine where a temporary capital would be and also where the permanent capital would be of the United States of America once each one of the states basically ratifies the Constitution and they become the United States of America. For that to happen, 9 of the states needed to do that. So the capital moves to the south, eventually to Washington, D.C., in exchange for the debt assumption. In December of 1790, he emits his second report on public credit, proposing the Bank of the United States. In December 1791, he submits his report on manufacturers, arguing for government support for industry. He's working himself to death, literally. His wife, Eliza, later says he rarely slept more than 3 or 4 hours. He's writing reports, managing customs services, establishing the Coast Guard, fighting political enemies like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who think he's creating a monarchy. One of the interesting things about the Coast Guard is in the book, they talk about how basically they were trying to figure out tariffs at the time, and they were trying to figure out basically contraband coming across. So he established several different spots where they would have somebody patrolling the coast so these boats couldn't come and basically disrupt things or bring things that were not taxed. So that's kind of the creation of why the Coast Guard started. And meanwhile in Vienna, Mozart is also working himself to death. As we were talking about, both of these men probably barely slept. Mozart did a lot of partying in addition to that. And in 1791, Mozart composes probably his most famous opera, The Magic Flute. It's a Singspiel, a German opera with spoken dialogue that becomes wildly popular. It's filled with messianic symbolism. It's about enlightenment, about moving from darkness to light, from ignorance to wisdom. The Queen of the Night's famous aria, Der Hohle Rache, requires the soprano to hit an F 2 notes above high C. It's almost impossibly difficult. If you've ever heard it, you know which one that is exactly. The music represents chaos, fury, and darkness. In July 1791, a mysterious stranger commissions Mozart to compose a Requiem Mass. Mozart, increasingly ill and superstitious, becomes convinced he's writing it for his own death. He works on it throughout the fall, even when he's composing other works, teaching students, performing. On December 5th, 1791, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart dies. He's 35 years old. The cause is debated: rheumatic fever, kidney disease, or a strep infection, and he's buried in an unmarked common grave in Vienna's St. Mark's Cemetery. His Requiem is unfinished. His student, Franz Sussmayer, completes it based on Mozart's notes. So one of the greatest composers in the history of the world composed a work that was finished by one of his students, and unfortunately, nobody knows exactly where Mozart was buried or where he was at the time of his death, put in the ground, as was pretty common in that time. Hamilton doesn't know this, of course. He's in America, fighting political battles. In 1791, he's at the height of his power, but it won't last. 1790s are brutal for Hamilton. Obviously, 1791 was not a good year for Mozart, as this is the year that he passed away. But in 1791, Hamilton also began an affair with Maria Reynolds, a woman who claims her husband has abandoned her. Turns out to be a scheme. Her husband, James Reynolds, blackmails Hamilton. Hamilton pays to keep them quiet, but eventually the affair becomes public. In 1797, Hamilton publishes the Reynolds pamphlet, probably the single greatest document of admission ever produced. He confessed his entire affair in extraordinary detail to prove that he wasn't embezzling treasury funds, and it just completely destroys his reputation. If you've listened to the musical or read the book, one of the things was that Hamilton someday may be president. This pretty much shut him out at the time for being president. It gets worse for Hamilton here shortly. In 1801, his beloved son Philip dies in a duel defending his father's honor against a lawyer named George Ecker. Philip is only 19. Hamilton is devastated. His daughter Angelica suffers a mental breakdown and never recovers. In 1804, Aaron Burr, longtime political rival, challenges Hamilton to a duel. Hamilton has criticized Burr more than once publicly, calling him dangerous and unfit for office. On July 11th, 1804, they meet in Weehawken, New Jersey. Hamilton reportedly plans to throw away his shot and to fire it into the air. Burr doesn't. Burr aims directly at Hamilton, and his bullet hits Hamilton in the abdomen, lodging near his spine. Hamilton dies the next day, July 12th, 1804. He's only 47 to 49 years old. Like Mozart, Hamilton dies with unfinished work. He never completes his vision for American manufacturing. The political party he built, the Federalists, will collapse within 20 years. His enemy, Thomas Jefferson, shapes America's self-image in an agrarian republic, not Hamilton's industrial empire. But Hamilton's system survives. The National Bank lasts until the 20th century. The Customs Service still exists. The Coast Guard still exists. American credit, American capitalism, American financial system, these are all Hamilton's creations, so they still exist. Every time the Federal Reserve adjusts an interest rate, every time the Treasury issues bonds, every time America uses its economic power as a geopolitical weapon, that's all part of Hamilton's legacy. So what connects these two extraordinary lives? First, velocity. Mozart composed 626 works in 35 years. Symphonies, concertos, operas, chamber music, church music. Hamilton wrote more than 10,000 pages in his lifetime. In the book, it details just in the first chapter that Eliza basically hired a bunch of people to come through about 28,000 pages of information that have been found on Hamilton to basically write all of the information that they had. It's just an extraordinary volume of work. Legal briefs, essays, letters, and government reports. Both men worked at inhuman speeds. Second, they both had fantastic architecture. Mozart didn't just write pretty melodies. Listen to the first movement of Symphony No. 40 in G minor. The way the opening theme transforms, inverts, develops through the movement, or the final act of Don Giovanni. 20 minutes of continuous music that modulates through multiple keys and tempos without ever feeling disjointed. Mozart thought in structures. Hamilton didn't just write about economics. Look at the structure of his report on manufacturers. He begins with general principles, moves to specific industries, analyzes obstacles, proposes solution, anticipates objections, and provides rebuttals. It's not a report, it's a philosophical treatise that happens to be about tariffs and subsidies. Third, they both used heavy systems thinking. Mozart understood that an opera isn't just a collection of arias, it's a dramatic and musical system where every element serves the whole. Hamilton understood that economy isn't just individual trading, it's a system of credit, currency, law, and infrastructure. Mozart was from Salzburg, a provincial city. He moved to Vienna and never fully fit in. He was too brash, too confident, too willing to challenge patrons. Hamilton was from the Caribbean, illegitimate, with no family connections. He arrived in New York with almost nothing. Both men succeeded by sheer force of will and talent. And fifth, tragic endings. Mozart died believing he'd failed, buried in an unmarked grave, his music about to be forgotten, or so he feared. In fact, the Magic Flute was already a hit, and within decades, Mozart would be recognized as perhaps the greatest composer who ever lived. Hamilton died in a senseless duel, his reputation in tatters, his political party dying, his vision for America rejected. Within decades, his financial system would be vindicated. Within 2 centuries, he'd be on the $10 bill and the subject of the biggest musical in Broadway history. Neither man lived to see his true legacy. Here's what fascinates me the most, maybe. In 1791, when Mozart died, Hamilton was designing the Bank of the United States. These two events have nothing to do with each other, and yet Mozart's music creates a sense of order from chaos, of beauty from mathematical precision. His opera suggests that human complexity, love, jealousy, forgiveness, judgment can be organized, understood, and expressed through structures of sound. Hamilton's financial system creates order from chaos, prosperity from poverty. His reports suggest that human behavior, commerce, ambition, and innovation can be organized, channeled, and harnessed through structured institutions. Both men took these raw materials for their age, notes, numbers, and built cathedrals. Today, Mozart's music is performed thousands of times every year around the world. The systems Hamilton built, central banking, federal credit, customs revenue, commercial law, under the American economy and by extension, the global economy. Two men, born in the 1750s, one in Salzburg and one in the Caribbean, one died at 35, the other at 47 or 49. Neither knew the other existed ever, but both understood the same thing. Genius isn't just talent. It's the ability to see the structure hidden in chaos, to build systems that outlast you, to turn fleeting inspiration into permanent architecture. They were parallel geniuses, separated by an ocean, united by vision. Well, that's our episode for today. Alexander Hamilton and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Two geniuses, two revolutions, two extraordinary human beings living in the same era. As we've talked about before, it's very possible that only a couple of these individuals live at a certain time, and the 1700s was just a time where they actually ended up having two. So until then, remember, the greatest legacies are built by people who never see them completed. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.